Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of a UK-based but remarkably international certified social enterprise called the Transparency Task Force. Our purpose in life is to try to create a financial sector that is more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. We passionately believe that the financial industry has a profoundly positive part to play in giving us financial security and giving us the kind of certainty that folks can maximize their potential to generate wealth for themselves and their families, and also to live a comfortable and secure life, particularly post-retirement. So the financial industry really does matter. However, we are very alert to the fact that it does have a bit of a bad habit, that the bad habit being its predisposition to misbehave if it's allowed to. And what we would argue is that the regulatory framework that governs the financial sector, not just in the UK, but elsewhere too, is inadequate in its effectiveness to keep that industry on the straight and narrow. So being very blunt about it, we spent a huge amount of time looking at the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, for example, but also becoming increasingly cognizant of regulatory failures in other parts of the world. For example, in Australia, we're very aware of what's been happening in relation to ASIC following a meeting we ran all about the ASIC story just a few months ago with Senator Bragg. Today, of course, we have the pleasure of listening to Stuart Kells talking about his book, Alice, the biggest untold story in the history of money. What a great line. The biggest untold story in the history of money. I love that, Stuart. I really do. Allow me to set the scene, and then I'll pass over to Stuart. Stuart will be talking about the book, what motivated him to write it, what the key learnings have been, what he thinks things may develop into in the future. But allow me just to set the scene first of all. So, back in the 1980s and 90s, amid an explosion in international money flows, a handful of people saw a new financial future and staked claims in it, triggering a battle to control the world's money markets. With phenomenal profits at stake, the conflict would go all the way to the United States Supreme Court in a case that involved not just the largest Wall Street banks, but also the tech behemoths of Silicon Valley. The extraordinary story of Alice Corporation, a company created to reimagine financial markets, brings together an unlikely cast of characters. Renowned author Kate Jennings, international banking insider Ian Shepherd, Enron CEO Jeffrey Skilling, German-born World War II historian Sigrid McRae, J.P. Morgan's deputy chair Roberto Mendoza, and his dog called Stanley. In the tradition of Michael Lewis's Flash Boys and The Big Short, Alice is a story of groundbreaking insights, legal intrigue, and improbable friendships. Pinpointing, and this is the key thing, this for me is the key thing, pinpointing the likely causes of the next financial crisis, Alice reveals the fight to build a safer and fairer financial future. Fantastic stuff, Stuart Kells. We're itching to hear more about your work. Please tell us all about Alice, the biggest untold story in the history of money. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, for that wonderful introduction. Does that sound okay sound-wise? The wonders of Zoom? Brilliant. Now, I'm joining you from quite a steamy evening in Melbourne, in Australia. I think there's a few other Australians on the call. And you would be familiar with me saying that I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country, and that's an important thing to acknowledge. Really grateful, as I said, to be here talking to you, and I think we're going to have a relatively informal conversation. I've prepared a few notes just to run through at the start. Andy and Andy's team have universal infinite rights to interrupt at any time or raise any questions, and I think we're going to have a bit of a Q&A as well, which will be terrific. So I'll power through my my notes, but with Andy directing traffic, fine to interrupt or ask questions, and we'll see how we go. So the name of the book, Alice, is a reference to two things. It's an invention that turned into a startup and a company, but it's also a reference to Alice in Wonderland and Alice through the Looking Glass. And that latter meaning is about how this book and the journey that it describes leads to a different way of seeing money and banking and financial markets, and a different way that's valid, that's actually accurate. So we'll touch on that this evening, or in your case this morning. My background, obviously, I'm a writer, but I'm also way back an economist. I've worked as an auditor, I've worked in public policy, and I'm very interested in matters of transparency and public policy, and I'll return to that theme all the way through. And what an important moment we're having this conversation, including the regulatory conversation that's happening in the UK at the moment. So talking about finance and regulators, really, really important. So the book is a few different things at once. It's a sort of a legal intrigue. It's a series of interconnected human stories. It's the story in particular of Ian Shepherd and the Australian author and feminist Kate Jennings. It's a story of modern finance and modern financial disasters. It's a story of fintech and the emergence of fintech and financial patents. It's a story of the inner workings of the financial market, which is one of those elements of the biggest untold story about how that all works, because that is the biggest market in history. It's about the Alice invention. It's about a patent infringement, and it's about the consequences of all these. At times, some of the material we're going to grapple with is a little bit hard going conceptually. I warn you, and I apologise in advance, but I promise you that it's necessary and important, and we can delve into anything that sounds a little bit kind of left field. So going back to the 80s and 90s, which is when I worked in first time in corporate finance, and I worked in corporate finance around the same time as my peers writing in this area, so people like David McInnes and Richard Werner. There was a huge increase, as Andy mentioned, in financial flows. You had the emergence of new markets, a lot of them quite disconnected, but a very, very big increase in financial flows, including through the emergence of new kinds of hedging and new kinds of securities. And at the same time, you had this mega trend of forces like securitization, privatization, financialization, and deregulation, and apologize for all of those mind-straining words. But all of them together were part of a mega trend, which was about a process of convergence and entropy in finance. So the breaking down of old relationships, the breaking down of old types of contracts into things that were more and more elemental. And several people around the world at that time saw where this was heading, this process of entropy, and they staked claims in the financial future. So you had Leo Melamed at Chicago introducing and inventing financial futures as part of the Chicago commodities exchanges. You had JP Morgan experimenting with bets on mortgages. And the thing that unites these inventions is that they're more and more sophisticated types of bets. So betting on financial futures, betting on mortgages, and obviously the JP Morgan inventions were a reasonably important part of the lead up to the global financial crisis. In Bermuda, you had reinsurers experimenting with different kinds of bets on natural disasters. So things like catastrophe bonds were part of that. And in Houston, you had Enron experimenting with bets and financial innovation around energy markets and energy services and energy contracts. And then in Australia, you had Ian Shepherd, who essentially came up with an idea that took all of those different currents, which were not at the same time visible to each of the proponents, but united them all. It was the one ring that brought them all together. And the Alice market was conceived of as a platform that could host any kind of bet, whether it was financial, whether it was on natural disasters, whether you're betting on retirement, whether it was insurance, foreign exchange, And a really important part of the Alice insight, which I'll come back to, was the idea of doing it in a way that was free of settlement risk. So I'll come back to that. So this was a pioneering idea and a very empowering idea, because it meant that people using the Alice market would be able to make clean bets on the housing market or their own retirement or weather events or securities prices, whatever it was, discrete events where the payout depended on the occurrence of a specified discrete event. And essentially, mathematically, these are what the market was based on, what are called Arrow-Debreu securities. So the single point contingent state securities, which are a very, very elemental security. So think about that process of convergence leading to these elemental types of securities. And so with the guaranteed settlement aspect of the Alice market, whether you received your payout based on the occurrence of this discrete event didn't depend on the subjective judgment of an insurer or someone else. It was directly linked to the specified event, and the money was held in a shadow account in the platform. So this was importantly an empowering idea for consumers. The invention was developed at the University of Melbourne, which is one of my current universities. And it was developed at an IBM centre within the university initially, and then Australia's National Australia Bank bought in to the startup. So it turned into a fintech startup. The business sought patents initially around the world, and then with a focus particularly on Australia and the US. And that was an important innovation, the idea of patenting a financial invention. For the development phase, the Alice team worked with a whole bunch of different partners, exploring different applications of the market, such as in energy markets, in insurance. They worked closely with Standard & Poor's in the US. They worked with the Australian energy market operator. They worked with banks, insurers, including in Bermuda, and others. So it was an empowering idea for consumers, but the flip side of that, it was somewhat a challenging idea for banks, because it would not involve intermediation, such as in the over-the-counter derivatives market of major banks. So in a sense, it had the potential to challenge the role of banks in markets like this. Fast forward to around 2001, and the startup had shifted focus towards essentially pursuing licensing and seeking to get value out of the patents. And it turned out that there was a major infringement of the patent by a group called CLS. Now, CLS is probably the most important bank in the world, and very few people know what they are or what they do, but they are a consortium of major private banks that essentially run the foreign exchange market through major countries like your country and the US and Australia. So CLS had infringed the patent. IBM, which had hosted the startup at the beginning, also developed the CLS platform that was involved in the infringement. And it was a series of back and forth communications that ultimately led to legal action in the US and a series of court cases. I won't go right into those now, but it culminated in the Supreme Court of the US. And the judgment in this now very famous case in the US, Alice versus CLS, not well known in the UK, not well known in Australia, but very well known in the US, really overturned the American system of patenting. So whole categories of patents were struck out or made immediately worthless. So software patents, business method patents. And that's why, again, as Andy mentioned, you had not just the big banks joining into the legal action, but you had the Silicon Valley businesses like Microsoft and IBM and Google, and you had major manufacturers like Hasbro, and you had the big pharmaceutical businesses joining in as well, because they all had different interests in patent portfolios that they were interested in either protecting or not. So some businesses joined in on the Alice side and some joined in on the CLS side. So that's a bit of an arc of the Alice story, and we can go into that in a bit more detail if you'd like, or any of the particular characters. The second part of the meaning of the title, and a very important part of this story for your work in relation to transparency, that's about the wider implications of the Alice story and the Alice discoveries for finance and for capitalism. And some of these implications are potentially very important for policy reform and for transparency. And I should say I've written about a few of those implications in materials that are available in the public domain. So there's the book, which you can borrow in the library, but also there's material that I've written for The Guardian and for an Australian public policy journal called The Mandarin, and also with the University of Melbourne's Pursuit magazine. So refer you to some of that work. So the key thing that Ian clarified about the workings of the financial system was the concept of reserves. These are very poorly understood, but extremely important in our current post-Bretton Woods system of interbank payments and monetary policy. Now, I'll come back to them in a minute. Another important insight, which I and Ian share with the modern monetary theory people, there may be some modern monetary theory people on the phone, and they're all, sorry, on the call, they're all good people. And they've correctly intuited that there's something wrong in the standard picture of financial markets. And the key thing is that governments don't need to borrow to fund deficits, right? And that's a very, very important thematically point for the UK. You've been drowning in austerity for more than a decade. Governments, I agree with the MMT people, and this is true, governments don't face a budget constraint in a structural sense. I'll come back to that, but they face essentially an inflation constraint. So one of the implications of that, we have this enormous enterprise of borrowing to address public deficits. And it's in the trillions of dollars in the US, but it's very substantial here and in the UK and elsewhere. And the idea of borrowing on private markets to fund fiscal deficits of monetarily sovereign countries is a foolish contrivance. It's foolish in multiple senses. It's foolish in a micro sense that it's not necessary, and I'll come back to why. It's also foolish in the sense that it perpetuates a myth that the government's cost of capital is the cost of borrowing from private capital markets, when in fact, the direct cost of capital for governments in monetarily sovereign countries, so ones that control their own monetary policy and their own currencies and their own exchange rate, is, well, the things that lead to the level of the exchange rate, is zero. The direct cost of capital is zero. So, and it's also foolish in a macro sense because instead of a budget constraint, those types of governments operate under an inflation constraint. Now, it is also, and to a degree, an exchange rate constraint, right? Because excessive money creation can create inflation, but it can also create a damaging devaluation. So some fiscal rectitude is important. Right? We're not in any way saying, and I don't think the MMT people are either, saying that there's an infinite money tree and that you can just create money willy-nilly. You need to have control and limits. But thinking about this macro inflation constraint, putting aside the strange, foolish contrivance of a fiscal budget constraint, within this macro inflation constraint, the great majority of money creation has no direct involvement of government. The great majority of money creation is happening in private banks, in large private banks. I'll come back to that. So what that means, among other things, is you've got very, very strong constraints on the fiscal side and very, very strong programs of austerity and the budget overlay and all that sort of stuff, but very, very weak controls on money creation on the private side. It's a free-for-all. And some of that money creation is for, a lot of it is for unproductive purposes like fueling asset bubbles and fueling the bank's own profits. So this is a grave imbalance between the public side and the private side. So I'll just go quickly into a few other implications around money, and then we'll hand over to a conversation. Let's think and remind ourselves of a bit of Finance 101 and some of the pillars of modern contemporary finance. So things that you hear about all the time, things you'll read about in the Financial Times and Investopedia and other places. You'll hear about the concept of the money market setting the interest rate. You'll hear about the concept of tax collection, the government collecting taxes and then using them as the basis for spending. You'll hear the concept of fractional reserve banking, the idea of banks collecting deposits as the basis for lending. And you'll hear the concept of bank runs, this risk that deposit outflow can actually endanger a bank, right? And then in the more specific sense, you'll hear ideas that are quite topical at the moment, like dollarization, the idea of a country like Argentina adopting, say, the US dollar as its own currency, for example. You'll hear all sorts of things about the foreign exchange market, as I said, concepts of money laundering, concepts of phishing scams and financial theft through the banking system, capital requirements and prudential oversight of banks, fiscal austerity, and the nature of money. If you read any of these sources, you'll hear kind of a textbook description of money as having generally three or slightly more, but three core properties: as a medium of exchange, as a store of value, and as a unit of account. So it's very important for everyone to take this away from today. People are writing about all of those concepts they're writing books, they're writing articles, they're writing journalism, without understanding money, banking, or finance at the most fundamental level. So almost everything you've read about all of those topics is materially wrong. And it's based on all sorts of intuitive assumptions which are incorrect. And I'll just quickly grapple with one example of that. The three properties of money as a medium of exchange, as a store of value, and as a unit of account. Bank account money, so coins and notes are increasingly less and less important. They're not traded internationally except by coin collectors. So let's put banknotes and coins off to one side. The actual total value of those is quite small compared to the total money supply. The overwhelmingly most important type of money is bank account money, right? And it's essentially a credit contract. It's a ledger-based credit contract. And as I say in my Guardian piece, there's no actual money, official or otherwise. There's no pounds, there's no dollars over and above the balance of your bank account. Your bank account is an IOU, it's a credit contract. And that kind of money, as I said, is by far the most dominant form of money. And it's extremely poorly understood. And one aspect of why it's misunderstood, the dominant form of money in capitalism today is not tradable. So to say that it's a medium of exchange is probably not correct. It's not durable, it doesn't circulate through the economy, it's not unitized, it doesn't have any actual reality, except, as I said, as an accounting entry. Bank account money is a store of value, but only in a very sort of limited sense of a record in a ledger, which happens to be the most primitive and ancient form of money, going back to ancient Africa, ancient Australia, and ancient Sumer. Those ledger-based societies and ledger-based money, we still have that. And bank account money is a unit of account, but only in a secondary and trivial way. ESAs, exchange settlement accounts or reserves, are vastly more important as a unit of account because, for example, claims to ESAs are tradable. So thinking about money as this sort of credit contract, this ledger-based thing, it doesn't circulate through the economy and can't trade it in the money market. The money market, for all intents and purposes, does not exist. You can't trade it in the foreign exchange market. We don't trade pounds for dollars. What we do trade is claims to the central bank, which are more like wholesale money. They're a stand-in for the old gold system, but they're not money because we can't hold them. They can only be held by major private banks within a particular banking system. You can't hold the money of a particular country outside that country's financial system. Right. So again, lots of things you'll read about the euro-dollar market, lots of things you'll read about foreign currency holdings of China, for example, is utterly wrong. So my 2018 book on the big accounting firms, the Big Four, was very timely because, as you know, Australia's been the hot zone among a few other hot zones, including the UK with Carillion and other things. But Australia's been the hot zone around the Big Four and their sort of problems. That book really pulled back the veil of mystery and obfuscation that surrounded the Big Four. And it was a very important framework for following up parliamentary scrutiny of the Big Four. It's been a real sort of go-to volume for Parliament and for other agencies and other bodies to really hold the Big Four to account. In the same way, now in 2024, Alice does the same thing for banking and finance. It pulls back the veil about how it all actually works. It pierces the wall of complexity around private banks and central banks and financial markets. And I think this is very pertinent to your work and your interests. Banks do not, having peeled back that wall, banks do not perform a pro-social function. They do not match lenders and borrowers, which is sort of an orthodox description of them. They do not perform important risk management functions. And most of their activities are very, very simple and not intertwined in a complicated way. They don't manage complex risks. And because we've got the quarantining of deposits from loans, and a lot of the actual credit assessment tasks are contracted out to generic service providers. So the profits that the banks are earning is vastly out of step with the social function that they perform. And that wall of complexity and obfuscation has allowed that to be the case, particularly for the largest banks. And also, I'd say the same thing or something similar in relation to superannuation funds and pension funds. They're really not doing anything in terms of managing risks. They're not doing anything complicated, and they're not doing anything that warrants the total social investment that we're making in those. And so final couple of comments. In addition to all those things, the banks, without any real scrutiny, the major money centre banks have positioned themselves with these monopoly roles within the deep bowels of the financial system. So ownership of the foreign exchange settlement system, that's a daily transactional a market that's daily transacting about $7.5 trillion US dollars, right? So think about it. If you're clipping the ticket on $7.5 trillion, 10% of 10% of 10% of $7.5 trillion is still a lot of money, right? So we've collectively allowed the banks to do that for no reason, because essentially the settlement happens in central bank funds. It's just because we don't pay attention, right? And so our job as people who value transparency is to shine a light on that and other areas where the banks have these sort of unique but undeserved monopoly powers. So all of these things need a lot more scrutiny, and your organisation is crucial to that. And that's the end of my bit.
Wow, Stuart, that's fantastic, folks. Before we do anything else, let's show our appreciation to Stuart for not only writing the book, but being with us today to tell us about it. Stuart, my mind is buzzing with all kinds of comments and questions to put to you. Your book takes us to, I think, a question that is of profound importance to society, the economic landscape, but more importantly, the political landscape too. That's how important I think what you're revealing in your book is. I say that because having spent 10-ish years campaigning in this space, what I once thought were innocent errors by the system, I'm now becoming increasingly cynical. Okay. So allow me to put to you what might be seen by some to be a very provocative question. Is it an accident that most of us are brought up with the idea that the money that banks dish out is money that they receive from depositors, and that there's some kind of matching process going on? We know that's not the case. We now understand that's not the case. We've had events with folks like Stephen Keenan, Bernard Thompson, and various others. So we understand that that's not actually the case. The question is it an accident that we are being miseducated to think that's the way it actually works? Or is it something, in your opinion, a little bit more suspicious than that? Thanks, Stuart.
I 100% agree. It's not an accident. People who work in this system, of course, understand how it actually works, right? So, and it's not just the private banks that maintain these false descriptions. It's also central banks. There's this bizarre sort of parallel descriptions where you read the website of any single central bank, and it'll contain 5 or 6 inconsistent ideas about how all this works, including through fractional reserve banking.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say it's in the interests of the people who are benefiting from this to maintain where we are at the moment. And obviously, it's not in their interests to say, oh, by the way, you're giving us this amazing public monopoly in foreign exchange, for example, and thanks heaps, we made another $100 billion today. The meta question for this book is, what's the financial system for?
Yep.
Whose interests
Perfect.
is it supposed to serve, right? It's supposed to serve our interests. We've made a wrong turn, a massive wrong turn, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's persisted. And exactly as you said in your entry, which I love that point, that the error correction mechanism is not working, right? The idea is that through politics and through the role of regulators, the error correction mechanism should iron these things out. But there's a few reasons why that is not the case, because deregulation, one of the themes that I talked about, has actually led to this hollowing out of the public sector and hollowing out of government and regulators. And so there's this huge tilt. And what happens if, you give these Wall Street banks and city bankers, the ability to act pretty much in the dark? What are they going to do? Well, they're going to serve themselves. And so part of this work is about equipping the public and the public policy debate with the tools to actually say, hang on a second, we actually do now understand a lot of what's going on. It's not how the big banks and the central banks describe, and let's empower ourselves within, this is all, we're not storming barricades or anything. This is all very sensible and within the current architecture, but let's revisit some of these rorts. The way that I've described it in the past is, in a challenging situation, we can't afford this huge drain of resources to bank profits, to superannuation fees, to foreign exchange monopolies. Let's look at those again and think about where those rents are going. And let's revisit this concept of fiscal austerity. I'm a libraries person as well as an auditing and finance person, and it's awful what's happened to public libraries, particularly in the UK. Some of the smaller ones, like in Birmingham, and some of the regional libraries, this huge draining of resources and this bizarre, allowing banks open slather to create money, including to feed asset bubbles. But at the other side, this swinging austerity for community services and for local libraries. It's extremely out of balance.
Stuart, this really is fascinating. Daryl put a great question in the chat. Please bring your question to life in a moment, Daryl, when I come to you and invite you to pose your question to Stuart, and also perhaps to explain why you wanted to ask that particular question. I think it's a fantastic question, particularly because at the moment in the UK, we are on the precipice of a massive deregulatory agenda. I'll talk about that more shortly. Before we get to Daryl, though, allow me, if I may, to bring to life the question I just put in the chat. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, I guess you could say, that quotation from him, we use it all the time. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. It seems to us, Stuart, that at the moment, all the incentives at work are actually quite literally encouraging banks to behave in a way that suits them and the people that earn the bonuses from them and the share prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they've become so powerful that they really have how can I put it? They've got their hands around the throat of the whole democratic system. I mean, that's how powerful they've become. So the dichotomy, I guess, is this. And this is an unusually bleak question for me. What chance have we got of fixing the problem if the people causing the problem have all the power and don't want to change it? For them, the problem isn't a problem, it's utopia. Do you get my point?
Yes, definitely. They're loving it. They're having a great time. Well, I think improving transparency, improving the information conditions for policy is absolutely crucial. So actually calling these things out, having this conversation, and getting this into the mainstream, which I think is happening, as you say. Some of the key thinkers that you've mentioned, and books like Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth, which isn't perfect, but is shone a light on some of this. So it is coming into the mainstream. We need to have that well-informed conversation. But also we need to use the political system, right? Because we do have power, we are empowered, and the banks will use this thing. Oh, you're going to spook capital markets, you're going to spook the the exchange rate. And so I think if we empower ourselves to know when that's real and when that's just nonsense, it's possible to navigate through reform in this area. And we've done that a little bit in Australia with the post-Hayne thing, even post-Hayne Royal Commission, and everyone should have a look at that, the Hayne Royal Commission, Hayne. There has been a bit of backsliding after that, but it really did get a groundswell of people in the community looking at banks and looking at profits and looking at fees. There's things that we can do, like putting a greater obligation on financial service providers to provide services that are in the interests of customers, for example. Simple law changes like that would actually have a big impact. And as I said at the start, also improving information and making it much clearer, strengthening the public sector, strengthening regulators, and getting a few regulators who actually aren't captured by Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or whoever that might be, and really empower them. So turn around. We've made a wrong turn in capitalism, and part of that was about weakening our regulators and weakening the state. We don't need to go full the other way around, but this idea of self-regulation, this idea of very light touch regulation just hasn't worked. And a very, very quick example, very, very congruent with what you've said. The Australian water market. So we have the big Murray-Darling Basin. We have this very neoliberal trading of water entitlements, and you have public agencies like the ACCC cheerleading, saying, "Oh, it's a market mechanism; it's the poster child for markets." And in theory and on paper, it works incredibly well, but in reality, it's a disaster. And it's this huge information asymmetry between farmers on the one hand and the hedge funds, the bankers, who are literally in there trading and optimizing, and in some cases operating in ways that would be illegal in the share market. So it's just such a naive model, and this naive support from these pro-competition agencies. We need a new paradigm. We need to move away from that 90s what we had in Australia called national competition policy, but essentially that sort of high point of neoliberalism. We need a new paradigm which picks the best from that period, but also really moves away from some of those markets for the sake of markets and has a stronger role for the state, but well informed and using all sorts of new techniques that we've now got, as you well know, in audit and in integrity. Our toolkit is much stronger and better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So let's look again at how we achieve integrity and how we get assurance about these key functions. And again, go back to that question, what are these things for? Whose interests are they in? And the financial system should be in the community's interest, not the financial system's interest.
This is just such an interesting conversation, and so timely with what's going on in the UK and indeed what's going on in Australia too. We're going to go to Daryl. Daryl, please do take us off mute, sir, if you'd like to, and just bring to life your question. And if you don't mind, Daryl, just start off with just introducing yourself and kind of sharing your perspective on these issues, and then take us to that very important question about the Glass-Steagall Act, because we really are at the precipice in the UK of a huge deregulatory agenda that I think is going to cause a lot of pain further downstream. Daryl, tell us about yourself and your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Stuart. I've been involved with the Australian Citizens Party for about the last 8 years now. They've recently endorsed me as the lead Senate candidate for Tasmania in the upcoming federal election. We've been all about Glass-Steagall banking separation, because they're taking our money to the casino. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but to have our deposits going to the derivatives market, it's widely reported in our mainstream media that our banks are doing very well. But if you look at what they can hide off their balance sheet, which is between the big four, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stuart, I believe it's something like $34 trillion exposed to the derivatives market between our big four banks in this country. We're broke over here in Australia. And it's been falsely reported. The need for Glass-Steagall banking separation is supremely important, and the Australian Citizens Party has championed the campaign for and written the legislation for Glass-Steagall legislation to be introduced into the Australian Parliament twice. Once by Pauline Hanson of One Nation and once by Bob Katter of the Bob Katter's Australia Party, each, of course, unsuccessful. But please expand on the importance of that for us, Stuart.
Thanks, Daryl. Great stuff here. Please do, Stuart. This is such an important conversation we're having. Thank you. Thanks, Daryl.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Daryl. I'm not personally across your platform, and I apologise about that, being in Victoria rather than Tassie. What you're raising is very timely. There's a whole bunch of different dimensions to this. So this idea of deregulation, the idea that we're talking about deregulation in 2024 is almost crazy. This idea that we can kind of repeat national competition policy and approach it uncritically. We need a different paradigm, as I said, and deregulation is not the answer. Different regulation might be the answer. The idea of quarantining, commercial banking from investment banking, I think is a very smart idea. I should say two other things. The Australian big four banks aren't necessarily, there's problems, but they're not necessarily the focus of my work, because they're essentially in Australia just glorified gigantic building societies. They're all about, primarily about mortgages. But I would point you to some of my writing about Alice and subsequent to Alice. One of the strange, mind-bending things that comes out of Alice and this different understanding of money, we're all accustomed to thinking that derivatives are materially different to bank loans and to bank deposits. But when you see how it all actually works, where the banks are writing these over-the-counter derivative contracts, the way a bank writes an over-the-counter derivative contract is almost exactly the same as the way they write a loan. Essentially, they're the same thing, right? They are a contingent contract. The bank loan is contingent on things like business performance and the price of money and the creditworthiness of the issuing bank. But essentially, they are derivatives. So over-the-counter derivatives and over-the-counter loans and deposits are all contingent contracts. And so that's a mind bender, right? Because you think about banks as this, banks aren't storehouses of money. They're profiles and collections of contracts. That's what banks are. They're not storehouses of money. They're accumulations of contracts, right? And so think about Enron. What was Enron? Enron wasn't a bank, but it was essentially a collection of derivatives contracts, exactly the same as what a bank is, but outside the system of banking regulation. And the risk of getting into risky territory, what's Bitcoin? What's the Bitcoin ledger as well? In some ways, it's definitely not currency and it's definitely not money, and has all sorts of risks and problems. But in a sense, the mega ledger that is Bitcoin is not that different to a bank, and it's not that different to our mainstream ledger system that we have, right? And I touched on this before. We have a ledger-based monetary system, putting coins and notes to one side because they're not really that important anymore, and putting reserves to one side because they're not money. What you're left with is this bank money, and it's essentially about writing. It's writing in a ledger. It's writing an entitlement. And when you transfer money from one bank to another, you don't actually, nothing moves. You actually erase one balance and write a new balance with new parties, new contracting parties. And the only reason that the banks do this, they're willing to do this, because deposits are a costly nuisance for banks. Bank deposits are a costly nuisance for banks. They are not an input into lending. The only reason they do that is because the transaction happens at settlement with these exchange settlement account funds, the central bank funds, the sort of bank gold, the post-Bretton Woods pseudo central bank gold. And just one other comment. There's this very, very 80s, 90s international conversation between the big monetary institutions and the central banks around exactly the sort of narrative we had in the 80s and 90s around central bank independence and that kind of thing, right? It's like, oh yeah, the more independence, the better. That's really old thinking. And I think, Daryl, would be congruent with your thinking as well, to say we actually need more control over the central bank. And we need to think of the central bank and the executive government as one entity. And ultimately, we already have control over the central bank, because if it's not under our parliament, who's controlling it? So this idea that we can kind of go to an extreme model of independence, where we even cut off the short-term ability for the parliament to control the central bank, is 100% going in the wrong direction. Sorry, I know there's a few different points and threads, Daryl, but I hope some of that's useful and congruent with what you're thinking.
Thanks, guys. My colleague Alexandra put a note in the chat at what time was it? It was at 9:47 UK time. I'm going to explain why we put that in the chat. I'm going to explain it by referring to what I see as the irony of all ironies. Okay, so if we step right back and we zoom right out, it's perfectly plausible to put together the following narrative. So greed in the banking sector led to egregious risk taking, where the downside would not be paid for by those who took the risk and profited from it when it was working well. The pain was felt by society as a whole. By the way, that pain felt by society as a whole led to in excess of 10,000 suicides directly attributable to the global financial crisis and the economic downturn that it caused around the world. I'll put a link to that data in the chat. It's from Oxford University. So the global financial crisis happened. The political response to it in many countries was austerity. And that austerity created a shift in the political landscape, very broadly speaking, everything shifting to the right a little bit. In some cases, in some countries, more than a little bit, quite a lot. And it's quite easy to see how the origins of the shift to the right can be traced back to the austerity measures caused by the global financial crisis. And in the UK, one of the manifestations of this problem is a complete flattening of productivity and economic growth. And the irony we now have in the UK is the irony of all ironies, whereby in a desperate attempt to stimulate growth, we have a government that is understandably hell-bent to get rid of all kinds of frictions in the system. And getting rid of those frictions in the system that they would perceive to be holding back growth includes deregulating in such a way that we increase the propensity of the very kind of malpractice that caused the whole problem in the first place. So zoom right out, we've got this. We've got problem. Solution to consequences of problem is more of what caused the problem in the first place. Stuart, I hope you followed what I've just tried to explain. Would you like to comment on it if you did? Thank you.
Just a very brief comment. It's Orwellian. It really is. It's a dysfunctional loop, exactly as you described. And yeah, these international institutions and central banks, which at least some of them are quite captured by the big private banks, are definitely looking after those interests and perpetuating this wrong turn that we described before. So yeah, I would say it was Orwellian, that idea that we can solve the excesses of the banking system by deregulating and removing constraints, as I said before, that's the opposite direction to where we need to go. And yeah, we need to really challenge some of those narratives that are coming out of the big private banks, who are incredibly well resourced, right? They're incredibly well resourced to protect these interests, right? And the importance of the financial system is less about the function of the financial system than it is about the profitability of the financial system. This is not them protecting a really important pro-social function. It's actually a lot easier than they pretend, and it's in their interests to pretend that it's all very complex and all very risky, and don't touch this. Even though the private banks clip the ticket and effectively control the foreign exchange market, which is the biggest market in history, the actual settlement part of it happens between central banks. So it's easy enough to unwind that problem. And the way that banks fail, bank failures, as I said, people think about this idea of runs on deposits. Banks don't fail because of runs on deposits. Banks fail because of shortages of exchange settlement account funds, and exchange settlement account funds are controlled by central banks. So in 2024, there shouldn't be any bank failures, right? The whole idea of this sort of prudential apparatus to prevent bank failures is actually solving an endogenous problem, a problem inside government and inside the public system around how we use the exchange settlement account funds. So one by one, we can go through and say, well, actually the claims made by central banks and large private banks around how they're systemically important and how they're doing all these amazing complicated risk functions, etc., and how derivatives are materially different to bank loans. One by one, we can go through and say, well, actually, people who know what they're talking about have looked inside. And this is not coming from a fringe perspective. This is coming from a very mainstream, well-informed perspective. Those claims by the private banks and their friends in the central banks don't stand up to scrutiny.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. You mentioned FX just now. I'll refer to something I just put in the chat in a moment. But please, before we do that, let's go to Bernard Thompson. Bernard and I have had all kinds of really fascinating conversations over the years about the money system, what's wrong with it, and what needs to happen to put it right. Bernard, please do reflect on any thoughts that come to your mind as a consequence of today's conversation, Bernard. And if you don't mind, just tell everybody a little bit about yourself, where you are, what you do, because I think folks will also find that interesting. Thanks, Bernard. Thank you.
Right. Now, can you hear me? I'm not sure. I can't see myself at the moment.
Yeah, we can hear perfectly well.
Okay, good. Well, I'm involved in far too many organisations with diverse interests, but quite a few to do with economics and finance. And it was sort of some chance opportunity that got me in touch with Andy way back. And I prepared a presentation on money thinking, oh, Andy's not going to like this. It's too unorthodox, perhaps. And I've given you a link to it. I think you can all download it and have a look, and you just get an idea of what I was thinking at the time. So it's really encouraging to hear, Stuart, because increasingly the myth that we've all sort of swallowed about how it all works, what money is, and so on, has to be really not just debunked, but completely shredded and tossed out, because it is so damaging for our future. So it's great to find people coming from all quarters to sort of recognizing that. I've been pretty involved with the old MMT type of discussion, but you don't have to join a club. You've just got to start, looking and thinking to see what's going on. So it's not a matter of converting to a new belief system. It's just a matter of peeling away the myths. And it's great that Stuart's able to do that so well. So I'm an enthusiastic explorer of the topic, and with a small group, I've mentioned it in the chat, which we haven't quite got there yet, but we're meeting again tomorrow to set up a little platform where we hope to, in some way, have some influence on financial reform in Australia. Not sure how we'll do that, but I think the more people that think and start to talk to each other, the better. So we'll hope to have a bit of a platform where we gather the stories so far, evidence, things that, massive documents that have illumined the issues, but then of course we all forget. The next news item takes centre stage, and on we go. The same old tripe is spoken by economists and their commentators about how it all works. governments say the same thing, because to speak the truth is actually so devastating for the existing, not just mental habits, but the whole structure, really, to see how we are being conned. And it's just not tenable that it continues like that. But there's a lot at stake. Most important is we have to become clearly informed and really get it to make appropriate decisions about what adjustments can be made, because you can't turn the whole thing on its head overnight. You have to find a way of access that will sort of incrementally shift things. So that's my position.
That's fantastic, Bernard.
Thank you. You guys should connect if you don't already know each other. You're definitely on the same page. Folks, I'm going to share my screen in just a moment, if I may, to bring to life a point that I think is really important. I'll do it as swiftly as I can. So please bear with me while I attempt to do that. So Transparency Task Force has been battling on many fronts for a long time. And one of the fronts we've been battling on is in relation to the FX market. Particularly in relation to misleading advertising in the FX market, misleading advertising that is causing consumers to think they're getting a good deal when actually they're not. So definitely fact-based misleading in the advertising of retail FX. And not only that, not only is the advertising misleading in terms of the rate people are going to get when they buy the product that's being advertised, but also misleading in terms of the regulatory status of the entities involved, right? Too complicated to explain now, but basically organizations are trying to be perceived as regulated and therefore trustworthy when in fact they're doing all kinds of things to kind of sidestep the rules for purely profit purposes. What you're looking at is an open letter that we sent to the FCA, having spent years trying to get the Financial Conduct Authority to take down some bad adverts. Long story short, despite our best efforts, that wouldn't happen. We couldn't get them to do it. We ended up going to the Advertising Standards Authority, who understood exactly what we were saying and got some adverts that were bad taken down. That's an ongoing battle. It's just an example of the kind of catastrophic regulatory failure that happens when you have conflicts of interest in the hierarchy of oversight overseeing the workings of the financial sector. Now, some of you will also know that the all-party parliamentary group that Transparency Task Force is very, very proud to be a part of has recently produced a report about basically the Financial Conduct Authority's shortcomings. This is a 7-minute clip on BBC News on Saturday morning. I'm going to play the first maybe minute and a half, 2 minutes, and I'll provide the link to it in the chat. It will just give you a feel for how problematic things are in the UK right now. And I'm sure all the folks in Australia will recognise the tensions coming about as a consequence of the concern about the workings of the financial system in Australia, concerns that we think might eventually lead the UK to some equivalent of the Hayne Commission. Let me just play you a quick clip. This is BBC's main news programme in the morning called Breakfast. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to hear it, folks.
8 minutes past 8, the UK's financial watchdog has said it's made big changes to how it works to protect consumers following a damning report from MPs earlier this week.
A parliamentary committee launched an investigation into the Financial Conduct Authority following a series of financial scandals in which consumers lost hundreds of millions of pounds. We're joined now by Dan Whitworth from Radio 4's Money Box. This is fascinating. This is really fascinating. We should kind of go through the process of this report. So what led to it in the first place?
A number of financial scandals, just a couple of them, British Steel pensions, London Capital and Finance, and lots of people lost lots and lots of money. And there was huge criticism from victims groups about the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, the clue is in the name, the Conduct Authority, about how it was regulating the financial market at the time. They heard from 175 witnesses over 2.5 years, this report, this investigation, and it's cross-party, so politicians of all political colours. And as I say, huge criticism from victims groups. They also spoke to current and former employees of the FCA. I spoke to one of the victims of one of those particular scandals, a lady called Andrea. She lost money in the London capital and finance scandal, and just that one scandal, £236 million taken, lost by 11,500 investors, all under the nose of regulation and the FCA. And this is what she told me about what she thought about this report and the FCA.
So the full clip is in the chat. Please do take time to watch it. Stuart, just before we came online, we were chatting about Adele Ferguson. Folks in Australia, if any of you could introduce us to Adele Ferguson, please do. She's a journalist that we understand was involved with the momentum that resulted in the Hayne Commission. We really want to speak to Adele because we think we're kind of moving in a similar direction. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to share that short clip with you, because things are really hotting up in the UK. In a moment, I'm going to put a link to the Treasury questions piece in the chat. The reason being that we have reason to believe that Bob Blackman, CBE MP, is going to be asking questions of the Chancellor today in Parliament about the all-party parliamentary group's report, and frankly, whether we would imagine he might be asking whether the FCA is fit for purpose. So I'm sure the folks in Australia can identify with all the narrative that I'm sharing with you today. Stuart, it's about 3 minutes past 10 UK time. We've got roughly 10 minutes left. We'll go to one or two other comments or questions from anybody. Be succinct so we don't run out of time. And then we'll go back to Stuart for the last 5 minutes or so, just to kind of pull everything together and give Stuart a chance to share his final thoughts. So please, folks, please do raise your hand if you want to come in with a comment or a question. Either do it digitally or literally wave something at me if you'd like to. Otherwise, we'll go to Stuart. Gone. In which case, we're going to go to Stuart. Stuart, back to you, sir, for your final comments. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Two quick comments, one around equity and one around MMT. One theme that we haven't really touched on today is this intergenerational equity question and the housing market and access. Young people really struggling. They feel like the economic system is tilted against their interests. This idea that government investment in social housing has to meet a commercial rate of return hurdle, and likewise the government investment in all sorts of other things as well is wrong. So we're labouring under the wrong model. It's tilting wealth and economic activity away from young people and away from pro-social investments, and we're all paying the price for that. In terms of MMT, this might sound a little bit kind of strange or grandiose, but I mean this in all goodwill. The MMT people, I'm sympathetic to a lot of their thinking, and it's a broad church, obviously, but I think the core of MMT, they've intuited something wrong, as I said, in the descriptions of finance, but they didn't have some of the resources and some of the insights that Ian Shepherd has been able to surface and that I've been able to write about. So at the risk of sounding a little bit like taking this too far, I see MMT as a step towards where we are now, and it's MMT Prime or MMT 2.0 or MMT in the mainstream, where we now know about the government's role in the extent of the government's role in money, the money supply and money creation, which is quite small. There's an insight in my work with Ian around the nature of reserves and exchange settlement account funds that's not present in the MMT work. So I would commend, again, they don't need to buy the book, they can borrow it from the library and they can read some of my journalism, but I would commend this work to the MMT people in all good faith and in all respect, because I think, as I said, that it's important work that they're doing. They're coming from the right perspective, but they didn't have the full picture. And hopefully, based on things like today's conversation, the MMT people will have the the full picture. And I'm a sort of I'm a child of divorce. I'm about bringing people together and breaching schisms. And at the moment, there's a bit of a schism between MMT and the economics mainstream. But I think with the sorts of insights and discoveries in this work, we can actually mend that schism. And then if we're all pointing in the same direction with the same authority, we can actually shift some of these debates. So that's just a bit of an appeal to any MMTers who might be seeing this on social media or on the call or elsewhere. That they're doing good things, they're fundamentally right. And with some of these further insights, MMT Prime could help reverse this wrong turn in capitalism.
Wow, what a fantastic conversation, Stuart. You really have ignited. If we were motivated before, we're even more motivated now to try to bring about the kind of change that's needed, not just in our hemisphere, but also in yours. Alexander, if you don't mind, please pop a link to the ambassadors page on our website. Folks, you may be aware that Transparency Task Force, despite its notoriously little resource, we have hundreds of ambassadors around the world in 20 or so countries, including in Australia. We ran a meeting in Melbourne a few years ago and also one a few weeks later in Sydney. And there's such alignment between the progressive thinking of us Brits and the progressive thinking of you Australians. The scope for teamwork is absolutely phenomenal. In closing the meeting, I'd like to say this, and I'll put this in the chat. We really must not forget the human suffering caused as a direct consequence of the kind of conflicts of interest, regulatory capture, the revolving door problem, all of which manifests in one kind of catastrophic regulatory failure or another. It really does translate into human suffering. I've just put a link in the chat to one of our volunteers who very, very sadly took his own life about a year and a bit ago, year and a half ago. Ian Davis, he became a victim of the London Capital and Finance scandal, a proven catastrophic regulatory failure. Basically, the regulator didn't do due diligence, which resulted in criminals being able to steal the money from thousands and thousands of people. So that's just one example of what can go horribly wrong when the system doesn't do the self-fixing exercise we were speaking about at the top of the program. The other link I'm going to put in the chat is the link to information from Oxford University about 10,000 suicides caused as a direct consequence of the global financial crisis. By the way, that's not 10,000 around the world. That is just UK, mainland Europe, Canada, and the USA. Have a look at that. Have a look at that. My message is therefore this, folks. We are not talking about some abstract, academic, geeky set of notions. We are actually talking about a failure of society to protect people from those who can and will do it harm for the purpose of enrichment, whether that be at a corporate level or at an individual level. In essence, Stuart's book is a very valiant and a great attempt to wave a big red flag saying there's something wrong here that needs sorting. This is serious stuff. It really is serious stuff. Whether banking malpractice and related issues has caused you to become a victim of financial crime and banking misconduct yourself, whether you or somebody you know have had your life shattered as a consequence of the regulatory failure brought about by conflicts of interest, the revolving door problem, regulatory capture, and those sorts of things. Whether you're involved in politics and are so frustrated in getting the democratic system to function the way it's meant to, i.e., to represent the true interests of the people, as opposed to representing those with power and influence. Wherever you are in that mix of interests, the only way real change is going to happen is if ordinary people like us wake up to the fact, and this is a bold statement to make, wake up to the fact that actually we have all the power. We just need to get organized, mobilized, and strategized so that we can focus our power where it really matters through our democratic processes to demand reform. Asking for it politely hasn't worked. Explaining it theoretically to show why there needs to be reform really hasn't worked. I'm not suggesting anyone becomes a crazy activist campaigner, but I am suggesting that the volume of our requests needs to change. Let's stop whispering to government and banks to say, please sort yourselves out. You're hurting people. Let's shout it. Let's shout it loud and bloody proud because we know we're right. We know we're right. You've only got to read books like folks such as Stuart to understand that we know we're right. Stuart, I'm going to come back to you for a final sentence if you'd like to make one, and then we'll wrap up today's meeting. I'm going to quickly, while Stuart is preparing to give us his final statement, I'm going to try to find the link to Treasury questions for today, because we hope that during Treasury questions in today's Parliament, there is going to be a piece about the report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group that we provide the Secretariat for. And if I don't find it in time for the meeting, I'll make sure that Alexandra circulates it later on, immediately after this meeting, by way of an email, so that those of you in the UK can watch it. It's at 11:30, and please listen out for Bob Blackman, CVE MP, co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, talking about the APPG's report that we've worked so hard on for the last 2.5 years. Mr. Stuart Kells, you have the final word before we wrap up. Back to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. My final word is just to thank everyone on the call. Thank you, Andy and Alex, for the session. Great insights, brilliant contributions from the other participants on the call. Great comments, comments in the chat as well. What an important conversation and a really important moment. So I feel privileged to be talking to you at this point when TTF are really, kicking goals, getting in the media, getting in Parliament, changing the way people think. That's what this is all about. It's a decentralised, grassroots set of conversations. That's how we're going to get change and people of goodwill coming together like they have this evening. So really grateful, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Mr. Stuart Kells, author of Alice, the biggest untold story in the history of money. Go get it, folks. Go read it, folks. Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. Thank you all very much indeed. Good morning to you. Good evening to you. Thank you. We'll meet again, I'm sure. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.